and then Amy will help with timing and things like that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me here, Thomas. It's really nice to be able to meet so candidly in a group like this of people who are really invested in the topics that have certainly taken over my life in the last 3 years that I feel really passionate about and resolved around and concerned with. So as you mentioned, I'm a science communicator. I've both done a PhD in science communication, studying it from a scholarly perspective around the role of emotion in science communication, but I have been a broadcaster doing various television or radio and podcast programs with places like the CBC in my home country of Canada or the BBC around ethics of emerging science and tech. And in 2017, I was wrapping up my PhD at the University of Copenhagen when, conveniently space opened up in my life to become obsessed with a new topic. I had published a book about these scientists who are trying to resurrect extinct species with biotechnology and how that's so ethically contentious. And, I was very deeply embedded in emerging biotech and not expecting this shift to occur. But what did occur was something very personal. And I turned 30. My partner and I started talking very seriously about trying to get pregnant. And this new manifestation of feelings came washing over me as I regarded what it would mean to get pregnant at the same time as reckoning with what all the environmental reports are saying, and of course, completely inadequate action from the political establishment, and it birthed a very painful dilemma for me. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, host has disabled screen sharing. Would the host be able to allow me to do that, please? And then I can jump into my presentation. Great. Can you all see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, this question, as environmental catastrophe looms, is it ethical to have a child, really was the entry point for me to go from appreciating the intensity of the climate and wider ecological crisis as an intellectual appreciation and make it a felt appreciation, a very emotional experience with profound gravitas. I fell into what we now widely understand as eco-anxiety and eco-grief, but I did not have any equipment for dealing with it. The conversation publicly around what these phenomena are had not yet emerged in the way that we see it. We've had such a drastic change of climate storytelling and the humanizing of what it means to wake up and face the full extent of what's happening. And I decided that I needed to apply my science communicator mind to this thing that was now happening front and center in my own life, and try to get to the bottom of it by applying some of my research tools and my broadcasting, investigative kind of traits in the way that I do my work to hopefully come up with something that would help others if they were also going through this. But at the time, I really didn't know if I was an abject freak for thinking this way, because I hadn't heard people connecting their reproductive intentions to the climate crisis in the way that we now see it. So this is a spectrum that was created by a climate-aware psychotherapist with the Climate Psychology Alliance in the UK by the name of Caroline Hickman. She developed it through clinical observation of many of her clients who are young people working, who she's been working with in the Maldives in the UK. And she's, to make sense of how this impacts people across, a variety of levels of intensity, she's kind of roughly grouped what she's noticed with hundreds of clients into these 4 boxes. So we've got mild, medium, significant, and severe. When the eco-anxiety is mild, she says that the feelings of upset are transient and can respond to a reassurance and a focus on hope and optimism, even if it's not rational or a bit ungrounded. When the eco-anxiety is at a medium level, the person might feel doubt in others' capacity to take any action. They could get upset more frequently and start changing things in their lifestyle, like perhaps quitting eating meat or refusing to fly. When it gets significant, the person will have minimal defenses against their anxiety. It'll become harder to mitigate the distress and fear and guilt and shame, and they'll have very little faith in people's capacity to take action or find the political will to address the crisis, and it will start having a significant impact on their relationships. And when it's severe, this is when it can become what we might call, dangerous or pathological in some states, because this is where we enter into potential suicidality, inability to work or sleep, complete disruption to one's normal functioning, and a deep and utter loss of personal security. And this is, I was actually just writing earlier today about how ecoanxiety connects with the theory of ontological security, that it disrupts people's capacity to feel safe in the world, which can then lead to all kinds of depressive and behavioral changes and anxiety symptoms. So I now see that when this happened to me, I was at the significant level. I wasn't severe. I certainly wasn't mild though. And I know that it was significant because my eco-anxiety was starting to take a toll on others around me. I became that person who was very information seeking, constantly looking for more scientific reports, not balancing my digital diet at all, bringing in as much kind of crisis information as I could, getting into various kind of subcultural conversations around societal collapse. I was speaking about my fears and my concerns and my rage at where humanity is on this issue every day. My partner had to ask me to take a time out on the way that I was talking about the climate because it was affecting his mental health. I could see that I was making family members uncomfortable and other friends, etc. And so something really needed to be done. I was so provoked by this dilemma around whether or not to try and get pregnant that I pitched a documentary to try and understand this phenomena better to the CBC. It was an hour-long feature documentary that allowed me to then go and do some research to see who else is feeling this way, if they are at all. And at the time, there was one grassroots led activist network in the United States called Conceivable Future that had been convening what they called house parties, where people could come together and talk about how the climate crisis puts pressure on their reproductive lives. And they frame it through the reproductive justice framework, which says that, justice in a reproductive sense is about much more than just access to birth control or an abortion or not. It's about, is there a safe environment in which the child can grow up and we can parent in the ways that are fulfilling for a thriving life with fresh water and good food and security. And so these early days in my investigations produced this 1-hour radio documentary called What to Expect When You're Expecting Climate Change. And it was very much a foray into realizing that this was something that was out there, but still very much a marginalized conversation that seemed to provoke a lot of feelings of distress when brought up in mainstream culture. The reaction to the documentary was very fierce. It's provocative. And this was before we get to only 1 year later when the conversation around this issue had really changed. In 2018 and 2019, we see an explosion in the conversation around the legitimacy of this concern to be worried about how we do our family planning, as Conceivable Future says, when the apocalypse is part of the scenario, to be glib. So, you get major cultural figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Miley Cyrus coming out and legitimizing this concern. You have some of the first academic studies starting that have not yet been published, but Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, a scholar at Yale in Singapore, has been doing the first kind of in-depth study of people's reproductive concerns that's forthcoming. Then we have a lot of surveys and polls coming from different market research and newspapers who are taking the temperature on the public. In this past year, we saw a very shocking statistic that in a nationally representative survey of the United States, 78% of Gen Zers said that they aren't planning on having kids because of the climate crisis. I mean, we just go warp speed on the discourse, really, in the public imagination, between it being, a very kind of small grassroots conversation to something that now many large media platforms have published op-eds or made little documentaries about. So that was really surreal to also track. At the same time that, we see publications calling climate anxiety the pop culture of the year in 2019. Oxford Languages that year tracked a 4,290% increase in the use of the term eco-anxiety compared to the year prior. And so all of this is demonstrating just a deluge of interest and experience with ways of relating to the ecological crisis on a deeper psychological level. Of course, this also mirrors the time at which we see the seeds planted in 2017 for the proliferation in 2018 and 2019 of the youth climate movement. And I think it's not a coincidence that Greta Thunberg has been so explicit about how her severe experience of climate anxiety was transformed into action, that we start to get a lot of this discourse running through the veins of our media ecosystem. Simultaneously, of course, there's the 2018 IPCC report that outlines the difference between a world at 1.5 and 2 degrees that kind of etched in people's minds that we only have 12 years to avert climate catastrophe, which also kicked up a lot of these emotions. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these buzzwords here: eco-anxiety, climate anxiety, ecological grief, solastalgia, ecophobia, and environmental melancholia. And I'd be happy to define them and discuss them later if you'd like to. But this became like a working palette for me, trying to understand the nuances and the subtleties and the importance of these experiential relations to a changing Earth, and what it says about our society at this moment that I wanted to find out more about. And they're all what the philosopher Glenn Albrecht calls psychotrautic emotions, emotions related to perceived or felt states of the earth. And I love this quote from him. He says, "The truth about fiscal irrationality and the insanity of deliberate climate warming will shock all the generations, and they will enter all forms of negative psychotrautic states. It will shake the foundations of current human identity to its core." And from the research that I've been doing since 2017, I believe that our species has entered this period now, and we're in the early days yet of feeling it at a massive scale. And of course, some people have been feeling this much longer, but we're in a moment of emergence, of awakening, and this is starting to spread and gain more understanding within a general population. And we must create new norms for how to handle and harness these psychotrautic feelings for our mental health and well-being and survival. So once the documentary was out, the radio documentary, and these feelings were, really whipping up in new ways in society as well as within myself, I became curious to go deeper, and I got the idea to write a book about not just reproductive anxiety, but the larger psychological and emotional experience of having this awakening and what it means to cope. So I ended up doing a residency at TED. They incubated me for 4 months, working from their offices while doing the research for the book proposal. And in that time, I interviewed more than 100 climate scientists and complexity scientists and activists and various mental health professionals and spiritual leaders. This is when I met Thomas. I reached out to Thomas to interview him, and in order to get a lay of the land, really, to see what I might be able to sculpt into a book that would push this conversation further, or at least deepen our understanding. And I've been extremely impacted in a great way by the climate aware therapy field, people in the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliances of the UK and North America, as well as Psychology for a Safe Climate in Australia, have been extremely fruitful in developing my thinking. And through interviewing so many of these climate aware therapists, I've kind of gone to therapy for my eco-anxiety without explicitly going to therapy for my eco-anxiety. So that's been really interesting and helpful. But it was through a research vein to be able to gather insights to then share with readers of the book. And I've been, particularly enticed by the psychoanalytic dimensions of this work. Writers like Paul Hoggett and Nancy Weintraub and some of these folks with the Climate Psychology Alliance in the UK, or Caroline Hickman, have really helped deepen my work with an understanding of the unconscious. As a science communicator who's not trained in psychology, I'd not been thinking about. And if you're not familiar with their work, I would just put it out there as something very enriched to explore. And many of these experiences helped me understand that no, I wasn't alone at all. There were many people going through these experiences at the same time. Of course, some much earlier than me too. And what's so common with people who have this awakening, this kind of epiphany of how terrifying things are, is that it produces this kind of internal shattering of narratives, of the belief that you had grown up with about what would be there in the future, a future of ecological stability, at least to a certain extent, and now realize it won't be there. And so this can cause a profound, as I mentioned, kind of ontological insecuritization we could see, which creates behavioral effects and of course feelings of distress and upset. And what's very interesting that's also being made clear in different ways is that, you know, typically privileged populations are not typically existentially resilient. People, the eco-anxiety researcher Pano Pikola from Finland has said that, you know, this process of reckoning with eco-anxiety has now kind of come out in the wash as being particularly difficult for middle-class citizens of industrialized nations who have been able to take their safety for granted, typically. But when we look to people from, you know, marginalized communities, historically oppressed groups, people who've experienced apartheid, structural racism, colonization, and so forth, who have not taken that safety for granted, we see that arguably they may be better prepared for dealing with climate anxiety and other forms of reckoning with the future and the present. And so, you know, I suspect as things ramp up in the future, we'll be seeing increasingly this shift of looking to the wisdom of communities that have not been taking such safety for granted in order to up the ante on coping mechanisms and resilience. So all of this has really helped me understand that eco-anxiety is not anything to be ashamed of. It's not a pathology. It's not something to medicalize. It's very much a sign of one's connection to the earth, and it's the vessel through which we understand our vulnerability. It's a hugely powerful tool to allow us to make the transitions that we need in order to not forsake what can still be saved and allow for the planting of seeds to produce the kinds of mutually beneficial relationships that we require with each other and other creatures and the earth itself in order to, you know, extend a human timeline that's worth sticking around for on planet Earth. And so I find it to be kind of our greatest natural resource, an incredibly beautiful occurrence that one can, if given enough time and support, work with and through to find deeper purpose and meaning in their own work and life, and alignment with essentially things that are fostering of enormous kinds of nourishment. So this is part of what thinking kind of backgrounds the book. Unfortunately, I can't see my cursor, so I can't move. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so the book ended up, the book proposal got acquired. It'll be forthcoming. And I kind of have three parts to the book in which I look at the eco-distress landscape and its various manifestations from acute trauma and kind of, you know, what we understand from psychiatric epidemiology and places where people are directly impacted, from crisis scenarios all the way to the vicarious trauma of doom scrolling. And also dive in a lot to the kind of psychoanalytic dimensions of what's been holding us back as a people, and how denial manifests in various ways to have, you know, really made a mess of the last 40 years that we've had to be working on this problem. And exploring deeply this kind of reproductive anxiety and the feeling of what it means from other people's accounts to deal with different parts of these emotional realities. The part two is really about going inwards and learning how to integrate your distress, integrate your dread, not try to paper over it or get rid of it, but understand it and sit with it and learn from it. And so there's a lot there of what can happen when you seek out psychological advice from climate-aware therapists, the kinds of tools and techniques and concepts that they engender in their patients and their clients. Accepting the world has already ended is a way of talking about social injustice and historical marginalization and the ways in which we need to reckon with various forms of endings that have already been happening. And when we bring history into this moment, we see that humans are prepared to deal with various kinds of endings that can be a source of resilience, but also point us towards the kinds of transformations that we need to make and reparations that we need to create the conditions to allow for in order to move forward in the future more healthily. And what it means to balance hope and fear, which is this really difficult, delicate dance that we're all doing at this point, and is where a lot of us can get lost going whole hog in one of either direction. And then lastly, it's like going outwards. So in order to go outwards and be positively transformed by these emotions in a meaningful, purposeful way, we need to first make sure that we go inside and understand what all of us is doing in that deep sense, but then be able to connect with others. So there's a lot of kind of innovative ways of having conversations and creating community around these feelings now, whether it's something like the Good Grief Network or other coaching communities or what various activist groups are experimenting with. And so I've been tracking this in a variety of areas to be able to write about how people are finding resilient strategies from coming together. Also what it means to have really hard conversations and how we can have hard conversations if we're parents really freaked out about what is in store for our children, how we can talk about climate change and eco-anxiety with them in a supportive way, how we can look at our role in this in a sense of, again, going for reparations rather than abandonment, what it means to try and have hard conversations across ideologies, not just across generations, so that is key. And the role of rituals and mourning and the political value and asset that comes from a collective grief like mourning. We can talk about that. There's kind of a lot there to unpack and summarize now. And what a new model for mental health really looks like in order to bring about a better 2050 based on what people at the cutting edge of psychiatric epidemiology, global mental health, and other fields like this are saying that we need in order to deal with the scope of psychic damage that is expected. So that is just a brief run through there, although I do have more slides I wanted to show you, and now my computer has frozen. There we go. Okay, lastly, I'll wrap up soon because I think I've been blabbering for a while. The book isn't coming out until 2022, and I couldn't wait until then to get some conversation out there around these general areas. So without giving the book away, I'm writing a weekly newsletter around relative research issues, offering analysis and kind of updates in the various fields that touch on my core interests, and bringing coping mechanisms to my audience of readers and so forth in Gen Dread. So it's a free newsletter, gendread.substack.com. If you'd like to sign up, that's a place to keep on top of the work that I'm doing and what I'm thinking about. And just some examples of Gen Dread work would be, for example, a deep dive on why eco-anxiety is not the cure, or sorry, activism is not the cure for eco-anxiety, as is kind of a very common sentiment now where people are trying to beat back the feelings and get rid of them by becoming a more despair-free, productive activist, but looking at the nuances of how that can also trap us and produce harm if we don't develop an emotionally intelligent approach that integrates dark emotions and allows for the opportunity to build deeper resilience with things like grief and depression. What climate-aware therapists can do to decolonize their practices and become more accessible and relevant and connected with the needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color by featuring a decolonizing therapist's thoughts on the emerging field, or understanding how scholars in the Global South are seeing problems arise around the discussion with climate anxiety that really does not connect with their globalized experiences of environmental violence and history, and why it kind of depoliticizes this conversation and isn't making them feel heard, for example. Or why climate disasters call on us all to take shared ownership of our own mental health through investing in our communities and really developing our social connectedness, our social capital, looking at what these available kinds of, as Helen Berry would say, the pearl and the oyster that's available here to be able to develop good mental health in our communities, what that looks like. And lastly, I'm really still interested, not just in the mental health effects, but also in the kind of ways that denial trips us up. And we have such discomfort and anxiety and ambivalence around even looking at the question of the climate crisis and what we're going to do about it in the first place. And so an account of a recent experience I had giving a presentation to a group of Nordic oil, gas, and coal executives, in which I shared psychoanalytic perspectives of denial as well as outright industry denial, and had a very interesting experience because this group of 50 men who are not used to talking in a straight-faced way about denial, instead of biting my head off or getting extremely ferocious with me as they could have, it was very uncomfortable. It was skin crawling. It was really tense to share, the evidence from the internal Exxon memos, for example, of the kind of misleading of the public that's been going on, but also their own turning away in their private lives as individuals from this. They slowly started saying things like, it's really intense and uncomfortable to be reminded of the terrible things that we do. I'm of the age that I'm going to die of old age and not climate change, but that doesn't bode well for my children. Or CEOs expressing that for them the whole feeling is a kind of Armageddon feeling. I mean, wow. So what does it mean to try and have these conversations across societal camps, really, and not villainize, but connect over the emotions? This is a goal with my work as well. So with that, I will stop, and I hope that we can have a chat about anything that might have piqued your interest. And I'll just flag once again, the newsletter's there if you'd like to sign up. Thank you.
That was great, Britt. That was just really well spoken, and I'm really glad that we've got you here. I think, Amy, you can probably stop the recording now, and we'll just move into our discussion.